Hello, Rich Friesen again with Rich's Reframes. Today I'm going to talk about the most difficult subject I've ever talked about. This is the one that I don't want to talk about, but I'm afraid I have to. One of the series that I do in Rich's Reframes is Dialogue with the Devil. And in my introductory video, I explained how this demon, the head demon on the earth, his name is Wormwood. Wormwood. That rings a bell. Anyway, believe it or not, he feels that maybe his tenure on as the head demon on earth may come to an end because he says all the demons below him aren't very loyal and they're looking to take his job. But anyway, he has done such a terrific job and that he wants to make sure he goes down in history and that people really recognize him for the terror, the misery, the heartache, the pain, the suffering that he's caused humans, and he wants to take credit for it. So this morning I was sitting in my office and I felt this warmth on my back. It just, got warmer and warmer. And I looked around and there he was, this guy with a grayish complexion and these funny glasses, and only this heat, this kind of glow was radiating off of him. And I was feeling it. And I says, hey, Wormwood, turn it down. You're going to burn me. He says, oh, sorry, forgot. I just love burning people, he said. But I said, but you can't burn me because I can't write your book if I'm, burnt to a crisp. So he agreed to turn the heat down a bit. And as I've mentioned, I've refused to write the book for him, but he threatened me with death and burning in hell forever if I didn't do it. So here I am. That's the background. And this, what I just don't want to talk about, because there's just so much emotional tension around this subject, is racism. I says, please don't make me do this. Wormwood, please don't make me do this. I just didn't want to do it, but I felt the heat come up on my, it's getting hotter in the room. I said, okay, I'll talk about racism, but I'm just going to take notes and I'm just going to tell him what you said. So he wants me to write this in a book, but as mentioned, those people who subscribe to my blog, they get the first peek at every chapter. So he says, I want to tell you how I maintain racism. And I says, well, that shouldn't be so hard. I mean, man is kind of like a racist animal, isn't he? Especially us white folks. And he says, no, it's really been difficult. He says it was really easy back when because other races weren't considered humans and you could make slaves out of them. Everybody made slaves out of everybody. Everybody dehumanized everybody. But then he says something happened. It was led by America that they wanted to make a change, he says. There was the civil rights movement. There was, the whole war against slavery, the civil rights movement, and then a whole bunch of social programs. And he says it was a change in consciousness that became more and more difficult to maintain the racists and the racism that really creates the deepest and longest lasting suffering there is. I says, well, what about the white racists, the fascists, the racist groups, the Ku Klux Klan? He says, Ku Klux Klan, they used to be big. I mean, we were like this. The suffering we created, he says, those Democrats who were the Ku Klux Klan, he says, man, we created suffering all through the South. I said, so you continue doing that? He says, man, it's really hard to find a Klanner or hard to find a white supremacist. He says, they're just so few anymore that I can almost count them on my hands and toes. I looked at his hands and toes. There were dozens of fingers on each, so I don't know how many toes he has or how many fingers he has. But anyway, he says it's just really shrinking. And he says, but we have to keep it alive. And this is really important, he says, because as long as everyone's focused over here on the white nationalists and the racists. He says, we can operate with impunity over here. If these guys were to disappear, he said it would be a problem for us. So he says we have to go to mental hospitals. We have to find kooks. We have to find people who are pathological and sociological, just all sorts of emotionally and psychically disturbed people, and kind of incorporate them just to keep these white nationalist groups going. He says, but boy, it's really tough. I said, so, well, if that's the case, and you're really operating over here, what are you doing? So I'm going to check my notes here. And he said, what we do is we create hate. We create hate. Well, how do you do that? And he says, well, first of all, he says, we plant images that trigger very old and very subdued racist tendencies on the part of white people. Well, how do you do that? He says, look at this picture. And he showed me the picture that's behind you, behind me, rather. He says that goes into the subconscious of everyone, black, white, brown, yellow, whatever the color of your skin. And what do you see? You associate certain minorities with riots and fire and destruction, he says. Even though you'd want to be an anti-racist, even if you're a white liberal, he says, those pictures back there, they are implanted in your brain. So he says, that's one of the best things we can do. Black Lives Matter, he says, is one of the principal organizations that helps us keep racism alive. I went, whoa, 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 whoa. No, 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 no. Black Lives Matter, they are all about ending racism, making Black Lives matter. And he says, matter? Matter? He laughed. Black lives just matter? He says, when you say that phrase, Black Lives Matter, what does the human brain do? It says, oh, they matter or they don't matter. It brings up the whole issue whether they matter or not. And just matter? Just matter? He said, I had an argument with God the other day, and he said that all people are children of God. And he says, Black lives matter? He says, when they are children of God, it's not even a matter of mattering. But the devil says, if I can make Black lives associated with mattering, then the human brain thinks matter, not matter. He says, and we can keep that alive. Let me take a look at my notes here. He said so much. It was hard. I wrote as fast as I could, and some of my notes are hard to read. But one of the concepts he said is really important, is that your identity is not your individual identity, but the identity of your racial class. That way, everyone sees you as a race or as a person of a certain race and not as an individual. He says when people start seeing each other as individuals, racism is so hard to maintain. I went, what do you mean? How every good person wants to see people as individuals and not, just as part of a race. Oh, he said, what about white fragility? What about that book? What about that concept? He says, people were starting just to see each other as people. But now with racist training and white fragility book and the guilt it's slinging around, when a white person now sees a black person, what happens? I say, you see them as an individual. No, 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 no. No, you see yourself as an oppressor. You see yourself with white guilt, and it's something you can't overcome. Even if you try to overcome it, it means you're even getting worse. There's just no way out. And as a result, you see that person and it elicits all these negative feelings about yourself and about them. And then you realize that the message is, they really can't make it on their own. It's because you as a white oppressor are oppressing them. And what does that do? He says, you think of them as more inferior. He laughed and laughed. He says, what a joke that the biggest anti-racist thing actually makes white people think of black people as more inferior. He says, we've got that one nailed. So I said, is the book author, is she one of you demons? He just stared at me and he said, we can't reveal who has sold their soul to the devil. But if in fact they're creating more racism, that we've probably had a hand in it. So, wow, I was thinking, you mean that the actual anti-racist movement is actually creating more racism? He says, we've got that nailed. We've got them fooled. I says, well, why don't people just call you on it? Why don't people stand up and say, hey, this is really racist? He says, they can't, because we've got the language so nailed that if anybody tries to call us on it, they're going to be identified as a racist and they're going to be canceled. They're going to lose their job. If they made a bad joke, if they said something that they really thought about all of this, everybody's got to be so nice and worship at the altar of white fragility. And everyone has to try so hard. And the corporations have to hire diversity and everybody has to be on board and nobody can say anything or we are going to cancel their friggin' lives. He says, nailed it. And I want you to write it up and show how I did it. Phew, boy. Oh man, that was such a revelation to me. And I thought, as a white person, I was trying to do so good, and here I might even be doing bad. But I belong to a transformational group that sees everybody as individuals. And we don't see race or gender or whatever. We're inclusive. Everybody is welcome. And then I asked him what about that group? And he says, do you remember the last time you went to it before COVID? I said, yeah. And he says, what happened? Well, one of the things they did is they divided us by race. I said, oh yeah, no more individual. And what happened? Well, I guess in every group, they talked about how they were victimized or what it was like to be in that race. And they could, communicate, support each other in their victimization and all that. And he says, well, those groups that really supported individuals and heart to heart and loving each other, no matter what our gender, sexuality, race was, all that. He says that was a big problem for us. But even we got them to read white fragility. And then they took that to the groups and they started dividing people. So now what happened, he said, after that exercise, and I says, well, geez, I kind of looked to see who was in each group and to see, what did they think? Oh my God, did they think I was oppressive? And after that in the group, I kind of, I was polite and everything, but it wasn't quite the same because it wasn't just an individual, but I was not them. I was different. I was excluded from their group in the name of anti-racism. Holy mackerel. Boy, that really hit me hard. But I didn't want to let go of the thought. And I says, well, I used to have a neighbor. He is very black from Ghana. And I once asked him about racism, and he says, oh yeah, occasionally somebody says something. And he went on. I says, but you run a business in Oakland. How oppressive that must be. He said, oh, occasionally you get some idiot or something, but let me tell you about what we're doing. And he explained how he's growing his business and all this and that. And I says, wait a minute, what about racism? He says, look, whatever they do, that's their thing. I attach meaning to my own life. I don't let them attach meaning to my life. That's my job. And Wormwood looked and he says, yeah, that person is a problem. I mean, he said, what if all black people thought that way? Our promotion of racism could end tomorrow because, oh my gosh, because if every black person thought about that and thought of themselves as okay and noted things of racism as just slight irritants, he said they would change the world tomorrow because everyone would absorb that. But as long as they think of themselves as victims, well, they need They need somebody who's a perpetrator. So somebody's got to play that role. And when you do, there are, of course, people who will unfortunately provide that role. Or in his case, he said, I'm sorry, that's my word. In his case, he said, fortunately, will provide the role. Oh my gosh. I says, well, who else do you have enrolled in your program? And this one, next one really surprised me. It said NPR. NPR? National, you don't mean National Public Radio. He said, yeah, National Public Radio. I said, how can they possibly? I mean, they are the most liberal, the most sensitive, the most caring. They talk about victims of racism all the time. I said, exactly. You nailed it. That they maintain the victim perpetrator concept so that you're either a victim or you're a perpetrator. And that just keeps sustaining racism. He says, what if nobody thought of themselves as a victim? It'd be over. So he says, NPR is one of our biggest successes. He says, do you have any demons in NPR? I mean, anybody infiltrated or anybody that sold their soul? Again, he just looked at me. He says, we can't reveal who sold their soul or what demons have infiltrated what. Oh my gosh. This has been a real shock to me. So he says, but there is real racism. There is real structural racism in the country, and some people have a much bigger hill to climb. And he says, certainly there is. And he says the biggest structural part of racism is schools and education supported by the teachers' unions. What? The teachers' unions? Our biggest success. They will do everything they can to prevent kids from getting out of failing public schools and going to schools of their choice where they have a chance to get an education. And in tomorrow's world, that's mostly going to be technology and require a lot of education to be successful. He says, we create more suffering among the minorities in the inner cities with the teachers' unions. Well, did anybody in the teachers' union sell their soul? He said, anybody? They all sold their souls. Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that, he said. I'm sorry. Don't put that in the book. Don't put that in the video. Oh, wait a minute. I just did. Maybe I'll edit it out. But anyway, so he said, what we've done is just amazing because coming under the guise of anti-racism, we've created more racism, which will create more suffering. And that's my job on earth, to create more suffering. And if everybody did what they wanted, and if the humans attached themselves to their highest self and just loved each other and didn't even think about race, and if the minorities took agency into their own lives and stepped out of being victims, he said racism would end tomorrow, and we can't let that happen. Wow. You mean it would be that easy to end racism tomorrow? Oh my gosh. If we could do that tomorrow, I thought, what a wonderful world this would be. He said, but that's why I'm here. That's why I'm proud of the suffering I create. And that's why you're going to write about me and write about my accomplishments in the book, Dialogues with the Devil. Well, anyway, so as one of my podcast listeners, you get an advance on every chapter. So thank you for listening. And we will continue Dialogue with the Devil at another time. Oh boy, I'm so sorry to have to bring this to you. Rich Friesen with Rich's Reframes and Dialogue with the Devil.